I did not flinch. I did not set down my wine glass with a clatter, or push back my chair or say a single word out loud. I simply smiled, excused myself from the table, and walked to the powder room at the end of the hall. And in those 90 seconds between the dining room and that closed door, I made a decision that would take everything from my son-in-law that he thought was untouchable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My daughter was 29 when she met him. She had just finished her second year as an assistant professor at a state university outside of Columbus, teaching organizational behavior of all things, the science of how people function within institutions, how power moves, how culture either lifts people up or quietly crushes them. She had studied it for 6 years. She had written her dissertation on coercive control in professional environments. She knew the literature better than most people in the field. And still, that is the part that kept me up at night for almost 2 years. Not him. I stopped being surprised by men like him a long time ago. What kept me up was watching my daughter, a woman who had spent her academic career naming the very thing that was being done to her, not see it being done to her, or maybe she saw it and convinced herself it was something else. I've had a long time to think about which one it was, and I still don't know for certain. Her name is Lydia. She has my mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness and a laugh that has, since she was about 4 years old, made every room she's in feel like a better place to be. She grew up in a house where we argued about books at dinner, and her opinions were treated like they mattered. Because they did, I made sure of that. When she was 12 and her brother talked over her at the table, I stopped the whole meal and said, "Your sister was speaking." I said it every time for years until he stopped doing it. I raised her to know her own voice, which is why when things started to go quiet in her, I noticed, his name is, and I want to be careful here because this is not the kind of story where I need to be dramatic about a name. I will call him what he was to me, my son-in-law. That is the only title he ever earned in this family, and even that one he forfeited. They met at a faculty mixer in the fall. He wasn't an academic. He worked in commercial real estate development, which in Columbus at that time meant he had his name on some new mixed-use buildings downtown and a lot of opinions about the future of the city. He was handsome in the way that men who are very aware of being handsome often are. A kind of practiced ease, shoulders back, eye contact that lasted just a beat too long. Lydia brought him to Thanksgiving that year, and he spent most of the meal asking her brother questions about his work in finance, while Lydia passed dishes and smiled. I noticed. I filed it away. By Christmas he had met all of us. By Valentine's Day they were talking about moving in together. By the following autumn they were engaged, and Lydia called me the night he proposed, and she was crying, and I asked her if they were good tears, and she laughed and said, "Mom, yes, of course, I'm happy." So I said congratulations, and I meant it, because I wanted to mean it. The wedding was in June. Small, outdoor, 60 people, a caterer from a Greek restaurant Lydia loved. She wore her grandmother's pearls. She looked like herself. That was the last time for a long while that I can say that unambiguously. It started with small things, it always does. The first time I visited them in the house they'd bought together, a renovated Craftsman in Bexley. His down payment, her name on the mortgage. I noticed that Lydia apologized before she spoke, not obviously, not in a way that most people would catch, but I caught it. She'd start a sentence with, "I was just thinking, maybe," or "I don't know if this is right, but..." She had never spoken like that in my house. She had never prefaced her thoughts with apologies for having them. My son-in-law had opinions about the house, about the way Lydia organized the kitchen, about the dinners she cooked, and whether they were the right kind of thing to serve when he had colleagues over. About her friends, a few of whom he described as a lot or not really our kind of people, which I found interesting since one of those friends had a PhD from Northwestern and another ran a non-profit serving foster youth in Franklin County. About the way she dressed when they went out. Not anything explicit at first, just comments. "You're wearing that?" or "I thought you had that blue one." little redirections, tiny course corrections. The second time I visited, Lydia's friend Tamika, one of the allot ones, pulled me aside in the kitchen while Lydia was getting something from the car, and she said quietly, "Mins, Whitmore, has Lydia seemed okay to you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And Tamika said, she cancelled on me 4 times in 2 months. She never does that. She doesn't return my text the same day anymore. I know it's probably nothing." Then Lydia came back inside and Tamika smiled and said nothing more. I drove home from that visit and sat in my car in my own driveway for a while. I should tell you something about myself since it matters to what happened later. I spent 31 years working in human resources, not the kind that processes paperwork, but the kind that investigates. Workplace misconduct, policy violations, complaints of harassment and hostile work environments. I started as a coordinator and retired 3 years ago as the VP of Employee Relations for a regional healthcare system with 11 hospitals and about 14,000 employees. I have sat across from people who believed they had covered their tracks. I have listened to stories designed to sound like something else. I have read behavior the way other people read text. It is at this point less a skill than a reflex. My son-in-law did not know any of this. Lydia had mentioned that I worked in HR. He thought that meant I handled benefits enrollment. By the end of the first year of their marriage, I had a list in my head, not written down. I didn't need to write it down. I had Lydia cancelling plans with people who loved her. I had Lydia second-guessing what she wore. I had my son-in-law answering questions that were asked of her. I had a phone call where Lydia mentioned, in a voice that was too flat for the subject, that she had stopped going to yoga because it just got complicated with schedules. I had another call where she said she was thinking about taking a semester of unpaid leave from teaching. And when I asked why, there was a pause, and she said, "He thinks I'm stretched too thin. He might be right." Lydia had never taken a sick day in her adult life unless she had a fever over 101. She was not stretched too thin. She was being made to feel that she was. I did not say any of this to her, not then. I have learned, over 30 years of working with people in painful situations, that the worst thing you can do for someone who is being gradually convinced that their own perceptions are wrong is to come in from the outside and announce that you can see it. They will defend the person who is doing it. They will protect the version of their life they still need to believe in. If I had said to Lydia in year 1, "I think your husband is controlling you," I would have lost her for months, maybe longer. She would have pulled away to prove to both of us that everything was fine. So I waited. I stayed close. I called more often. I visited when I could. I kept the door open without pushing through it. Then came May of the second year, Lydia's 31st birthday. She had wanted a dinner out. That was all she asked for. A restaurant, family, a nice evening. She chose the place herself, a steakhouse in the short north that she'd been wanting to try. The reservation was for 8 people, her husband, her brother and his wife, her father and his girlfriend, my sister and her husband, and me. I arrived first and waited at the bar. My son-in-law arrived with Lydia and his sister, who had apparently been added to the guest list sometime in the previous week, without Lydia mentioning it to me. His sister, I'll call her what she was, had been divorced for 2 years, and had, in that time, developed a great many opinions about how marriages should work, most of which seemed to center on the idea that wives who maintained their own careers and social lives were the source of marital instability. I had met her exactly twice before. Both times she had spoken mostly to her brother, and occasionally to the men at the table we were seated. Wine was poured, the menus came. Lydia picked up her menu and started reading it, the way any normal person does at a restaurant they've been looking forward to, and she said, "I'm thinking the filet, or maybe the branzino." And my son-in-law looked at her over his own menu and said, without lowering his voice, "You always overthink ordering. Just get the chicken, it's easier." Lydia put her menu down slightly. "I want to try the filet," she said. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, something between amusement and dismissal. You'll complain if it's overcooked. Then I'll order it medium well and it won't be. And then his sister. And I want you to understand that this was Lydia's birthday dinner, that we were there to celebrate her, that Lydia was the reason any of us were at that table. His sister looked up from her menu and said, "Some women just need someone to make decisions for them. It's actually sweet." She said it, like she was paying a compliment. The table went quiet in that specific way that tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone heard, and no one knows how to address. I looked at Lydia. Her face did not change expression. That was the part that broke something in me, not the comment, not my son-in-law's dismissal, but the fact that Lydia's face did not change. She had gotten practiced at that. She had learned how to make her face stay still. I set down my wine glass, gently. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and said, "Excuse me for just a moment," to no one in particular, and I walked to the back of the restaurant where the restrooms were. I stood in that little hallway between the kitchen and the ladies' room, and I thought for about 45 seconds. Then I took out my phone. I sent 2 texts. The first was to a woman named Patricia Alderman, who had been the Chief Human Resources Officer at my son-in-law's development firm for 6 years and was a former colleague of mine. We had served together on a state-level HR ethics board. We trusted each other with things that didn't go in writing. The text I sent her was brief. It said, "Need 10 minutes when you can. Personal but related to professional. Trust your discretion as always." The second text was to Lydia's oldest friend, a woman named Courtney. No, wait, I need to stop myself. That name is on the list. Her oldest friend, a woman named Joelle, who is a licensed clinical social worker and has been trying to get Lydia to call her for months. Texted Joelle, "She's going to need you. Keep the door open." Then I went back to the table. I did not address what had been said. I ordered the filet, and when the waiter asked how I wanted it, I said medium rare, and I said it clearly, and I saw Lydia watch me do that. The dinner continued. My son-in-law told a long story about a development project. His sister laughed in the right places. My ex-husband's girlfriend, who is a lovely woman named Paula, and has the social instincts of a diplomat, steered the table towards safer conversations. Lydia's brother said little but caught my eye once across the table and held it. When the dessert came, my son-in-law announced that he and Lydia would need to leave early because they had an early morning, and he said it in the same tone he'd used all evening. The tone of a man who has decided something and is informing others of his decision. Lydia glanced at me. Just for a second. I smiled at her. I said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart, I love you." She held on to the hug a little longer than usual. 3 days later, I called her in the afternoon when I knew he would be at work. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been near her phone. We talked about small things for a few minutes, and then she went quiet and I said, "Lydia, you can talk to me." There was a long pause and then she said, "I think I've lost myself a little, Mom, and I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to explain it," I said. "I see it," she cried. Not dramatically. Lydia doesn't cry that way. She cried the way people do when they've been holding something for a very long time, and someone finally says the words that give them permission to put it down. I asked her one question. I said, "Has he ever touched you in a way that frightened you?" Another long pause. Then she said, "Not the way you mean. But he grabbed my arm once when I tried to leave during an argument, hard enough that it surprised me, hard enough that I thought about it afterward." I said, "Okay." I said, "I need you to do a few things for me. Not today, not all at once, but when you can." I told her to photograph any messages on her phone that she felt uncomfortable about. I told her to call Joelle. I told her to think about whether there was a financial account that was only in her name. I told her that if she ever felt unsafe, she should call me first and 911 second, in whatever order made sense in the moment. She said, "You're not going to tell me to leave him." I said, "I'm going to tell you what I know is true, and then I'm going to let you decide. What I know is true is that the person I see when I talk to you on the phone is not the person I raised. And the person I raised was not someone who apologized before she had opinions. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't think you noticed." I said, "Baby, I never stopped noticing. In the weeks that followed, I let things develop the way they needed to develop." Patricia Alderman came back to me. She was careful about what she said, because she is a professional, and her first obligations are to her organization. But what she was able to tell me, in the language people use when they are telling you something without technically saying it, was that my son-in-law's reputation within his firm was not as solid as he presented, that there had been a formal complaint from a junior employee that had been settled quietly, that his partnership track, which he spoke about as though it were a formality, was not as certain as he believed. She also mentioned, in passing, that the firm was undergoing a restructuring and that external references for senior staff were being reviewed as part of that process. I thanked her for her time and told her I trusted her judgment on whatever she felt was appropriate within her role. 2 weeks later, Lydia called me and told me that her husband had come home in a bad mood and told her there had been some issues at work and that he wasn't sure about the timeline for his partnership anymore. She said he had been cold to her all evening and she'd eaten dinner alone in the kitchen while he watched something in the other room. "I don't know what I did," she said. "You didn't do anything," I said. "How do you know?" "Because the things you do don't affect his partnership timeline, Lydia. Those are separate systems. He's transferring his frustration to you because that is a habit he's developed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, sometimes you sound less like my mom and more like someone who's spent 30 years figuring out how people work. Those aren't different things," I said. Over the following month, Lydia began calling Joelle. She began slowly to name the things that had been happening. Joelle told me later, with Lydia's permission, that Lydia had come in already knowing the vocabulary. She'd taught this material. The moment she started applying it to her own life, things moved quickly. By August, Lydia had spoken with a family law attorney. She had a separate savings account. She had documentation. She told her husband she wanted a separation on a Tuesday evening after dinner. She had asked me to be available by phone and I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea, waiting. She called me at 8:47 p.m. She said it had not gone well. She said he had accused her of being influenced by her mother, which I found somewhat flattering, given that the result he was complaining about was my daughter choosing her own life. She said he had told her she was making a mistake she'd regret, that no one would take her side, that she'd be starting over alone at 31. She said, "He really believed all of that." I said, "Men like him usually do." She moved into a furnished apartment the following weekend. Her brother and his wife helped her. So did Joelle. I drove down with a carload of things she'd had in storage at my house. Her grandmother's mixing bowls, a lamp she'd loved since college, a set of bookshelves I'd kept meaning to deliver. We put the apartment together in an afternoon, and at some point Lydia stood in the middle of the living room looking at her books on the shelves, and she exhaled in a way that made it clear she had not fully exhaled in a very long time. "It feels like me in here," she said. I said, "That's because it is." The divorce was finalized the following spring. It was not dramatic in the end. He did not fight it as hard as he'd promised he would, partly because the partnership conversation had become a separation conversation, and he had other concerns occupying his attention. Lydia was awarded her share of the home equity, which was considerable, and she bought a condo in Columbus that she picked out entirely by herself and decorated exactly the way she wanted. His sister, I heard from someone who knew someone, was telling people that Lydia had been cold and difficult to be close to, which is the kind of thing people say when the alternative is admitting that they laughed at someone's expense and enabled something they shouldn't have. I didn't bother being angry about it. I had spent 31 years learning that the story people tell about you when you leave the room is usually more about them than it is about you. What I want to say, if there's anyone listening to this who sees their own daughter in what I've described or who sees themselves, is this. The quieting is the first sign. Not anger, not obvious control. The quieting. When a person who has always had a voice starts prefacing everything they say with an apology for saying it. When they cancel on the people who love them again and again until those people stop expecting them. When their face goes still at a dinner table because stillness has become the safest expression to wear, that is the moment to pay attention. You don't storm in. You don't deliver ultimatums. You stay close. You keep the door open. You make sure they know, in small ways and large ones, that there is a place where they are still seen as who they were before someone started telling them that person wasn't quite right. And you document whatever you can, whatever they're willing to share, dates, messages, photographs of anything that shouldn't be explained away. Not to build a case, though sometimes a case is what's needed, but because when someone has spent 2 years being told their perception of reality is wrong, having evidence of that reality in their hands is its own kind of medicine. Lydia teaches again. Full course load, 2 sections of the same class she was going to give up when he thought she was stretched too thin. She has dinner with Tamika and Joelle every other week. She calls me on Sunday mornings, which we didn't do before all of this, and which I hope we do for the rest of my life. Last month she told me that one of her students came to office hours and started crying and said she wasn't sure what was happening in her relationship, but something felt wrong. Lydia told me she sat with that student for 45 minutes. She said she told her, "Trust the part of you that knows something is wrong. That part is not confused. That part is trying to protect you. I want you to know that I did not raise a woman who couldn't take care of herself." What happened to Lydia can happen to any woman, no matter how smart she is, no matter what she knows. Coercion is not about intelligence. It is about proximity and time, and the slow, patient replacement of one reality with another. The people who do it are counting on you to doubt yourself before you doubt them. Don't, whatever city you're listening from tonight, if any part of this felt familiar, save the messages, take the photographs, call the person who knew you before. And if that person is a mother, she already knows something is wrong. She's just waiting for you to give her permission to say so. What part of this story stayed with you, and where are you listening from tonight? Leave it in the comments. I read everyone.